With me is the Treasurer, Wayne Swan, in the studio.
Good evening.
Good evening. Wayne Swan, last year you promised with certainty a $1.5 billion surplus. Tonight you've delivered an $18 billion deficit. How can you look Australians in the eye?
Very clearly, because circumstances changed dramatically. They started to change at the end of last year. They changed more dramatically this year, and we're looking at a $17 billion revenue write-down in 12-13. And we had a clear choice. To make up for that, we could have cut to the bone. That's the approach of the Liberals. But we decided that we will support jobs and growth as our number one priority and come back to surplus on a more gradual plane. That's what we're doing. And that's a responsible thing to do.
You mentioned the $17 billion revenue write-down. Your deficit's $18 billion. You would have still been in deficit even if you'd earned every last cent that you'd anticipated.
Well, there are swings and roundabouts. The fact is that the great bulk of the deficit is a revenue write-down. It's a revenue write-down caused by an unprecedented event in our economy. As you and I discussed on your program a few weeks ago, we had 3 quarters of nominal growth below real growth, not seen before. This has not happened in 50 years. And I'm looking Australians fairly and squarely in the eye and saying, we had a choice. You could decide to cut to the bone, like the Liberals would, in the face of revenue write-down, or have a more gradual pathway back to surplus. But also, and this is the other thing that the budget does, is it makes the very big investments for the future that are the core of future prosperity and fairness in Australia.
I'll come to those investments in a second. I just want to stick with the revenue write-downs. You've mentioned them a couple of times, but in 2010-11 revenue grew by 6%. The following year it grew by 9%. This year it's grown by 6%. Doesn't that indicate Australia doesn't have a problem with revenue? Australia has a problem with overspending based on inflated expectations.
Well, those figures certainly don't demonstrate that. But
well, you agree that revenue's up this year?
Yeah, revenue is up, but it's up nowhere on what was forecast. Nowhere on what the Treasury forecast. Can I just take you through some facts, you see, Lee? The original high point of our revenue forecasts were actually delivered in the 2010 PFO. That is the document that is produced prior to the election. Now, there have been downgrades in revenue growth since then. What we have seen in this past year, however, is something that is completely different from any normal event. So it's been a savage downgrade in the amount of revenue that was forecast for this year. That is how you budget.
Nonetheless, you're getting revenue growth of around 6%, and which is great, and you can't contain your spending in that.
No, that's not true. Our spending is at sort of 25-year levels in terms of the last 25 years. It is not out of control. What we have here is a revenue problem, and the fact is that you shouldn't slash the budget to make up for the fact that there are revenue downgrades.
So that's why we're running. I've just pointed out, using your own figures, that revenue has grown in a really healthy manner for the past 3 years.
Well, it hasn't grown in a healthy manner at all, and it certainly hasn't grown in a healthy manner. The fact is that our economy grows. The Treasury forecasts the revenue growth figures. The fact is that we are down $17 billion on their forecast at the last budget. The consequence of that is if we were to make up for that, we would have to slash and burn. So I guess what you're advocating is that we slash and burn to the tune of $17 billion, which would tank jobs in our economy. It wouldn't be the responsible thing to do.
I'm not advocating anything, I'm questioning your assertions.
Well, we've got to look at the alternative.
Isn't the biggest issue for the Australian budget the inbuilt problem that existing and in some cases quite old policies are costing more than anybody anticipated? There's a whole raft of them: the cost of managing asylum seekers, Medicare benefits, the youth allowance.
We've been making structural saves in our budget from day one, and as I said in my speech tonight, we've now made $300 billion worth of structural saves. For example, spending in health is growing pretty strongly. We have made structural changes in our health spending tonight, and we have continued to do that across our budget over time. So we understand that you have to be hard at work making those structural saves in areas of the budget which are growing more quickly than average. That is just normal budget approach. That's what we've been doing.
But you've got a lot of areas. There was an entire page worth of things that have blown out quite substantially that presumably will continue to keep blowing out.
Well, we do see variations in health, for example, because more people will go to the doctor. So what we've done is we've made structural savings in health, and we've made structural savings across a range of areas. We've made structural savings, for example, in the tax system, because we've discovered loopholes which are being exploited there. So there's a range of savings. Good government is always making structural saves in its budget. The previous government never did that sort of work because their revenue just continued to roll in at a really strong rate. That has not been the case with this government, and the consequence of that is that we've applied fiscal discipline. Our spending levels are relatively low in terms of historical averages, and that what we are doing is finding the structural saves to make room for the new programs. So in terms of the new programs we've put in here, we have found savings across our budget over a 10-year period to make room for these new initiatives.
But how can we possibly trust you over a 10-year period when Treasury couldn't get 1 year right?
Well, if you want to take shots at the Treasury, go for your life. But the fact is that the same people that do our forecast did the forecast for the previous government.
But
My
point, regardless, is how do we trust a 10-year forecast?
Well, we have made the structural savings. We've removed programs. They do the forecasting of that. Everybody else in the community relies upon our professional officers in the Treasury, and I think you should too as well.
But you said this year things change, so how do we know? I mean, presumably things are really going to change over the next 10 years.
Well, guess what? When you have a 1 in 50-year event, nobody can forecast it or predict it. And that is what happened with the $17 billion write-down that we've had this year.
Well,
there'll always be variance from the forecasts, but generally the Treasury published recently a complete analysis of its forecasting record. It's there for you and other commentators to read, and I recommend you have a read.
But that means that you can't possibly say that on your big ticket items, Gonski and the NDIS, that over 10 years they'll definitely happen as you promise that they will, because circumstances change.
Well, circumstances will always change in a budget. What we have done is the responsible thing, which is to find saves over a 10-year period, which equate to the amount of money we are spending over a 10-year period in that area. We've done that in a professional, considered and methodical way. That's what governments do, and they do it working with professional advisors. But of course, events come out of the blue. I mean, nobody predicted the global financial crisis when it came. Governments responded. In this country, we got that big economic call right, put in place the best response of any developed economy. The consequence is, here in this country, we're 13% bigger than we were prior to the global financial crisis. So we are getting a lot of the big economic decisions right.
So aren't you sending a confusing message to Australians, which is you're saying, well, all the good news, that's thanks to us, but the bad news, no, that's nothing to do with us.
Well, but far from it. I mean, I went public last December when we saw the first beginnings of this very substantial revenue downgrade.
And
I said then that it would be unlikely we'd come back to surplus. That revenue downgrade continued to get bigger as we saw the tax collections come in through February and March and April this year. And at every stage, I've kept the public informed about that, and so too has the Prime Minister.
On the cost of dealing with the enormous surge of asylum seekers coming to Australia, you've budgeted $2.8 billion next year for offshore asylum management, but after that it drops to $1.7 billion. So does that mean we can take it that you think a future Prime Minister, Abbott, will be successful at stopping the boats?
No, and that's a ridiculous proposition to put.
So why is it dropping when the numbers coming are going like that?
Well, because we will always be taking initiatives to stem the flow, and we will continue to do that. We have been opposed by the Liberal Party in terms of proceeding with proposals for offshore processing in Malaysia, for example, and there are other initiatives that we are putting in place, which we will put in place over a period of time, and they will impact on the flow in future years. But what we have done, I'll be very clear about this, Lee, we have fully accounted for the arrivals that have come so far this year, and we've put it all in the budget. It's all there for people to see.
Wayne Swan, are you going to contest the election in September?
Of course.
Do you think that you should reconsider that, given that your track record as Treasurer, as Australians may see it, could be over-promising and under-delivering?
Lee, there's nothing I'm prouder of than my record as Treasurer. We have an economy which is 13% bigger than it was prior to the global financial crisis. We put in place the most successful response to the global financial crisis and the global recession of any developed economy in the world. We have an unemployment rate, one of the lowest in the world. We have a big investment pipeline. We have record low interest rates, and we have contained inflation. I'm really proud of that, and I'm proud of what our government has done over a 5.5-year period.
Treasurer Wayne Swan, thank you very much for racing down to join us tonight on a very busy day for you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.